Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. So, here we are from group 5. We will explain about Victorian period. Our member is Iqbal Hidayatullah, Krishna Aditya Putra, Muhammad Reza Fakhi, Tamami Maisaroh, Muhammad Bagas Kosam, and Nur Hidayatul Fatihah. Okay, let's start. So, the first, we will explain about the introductions, and the second, we will explain about the characteristic of Victorian prose, and the last, we will explain about the literary features. Okay, let's jump right into it.
Introduction. The Victorian period was in the late 19th century, spanning the years of 1837 till 1901, the years that Queen Victoria ruled England, Great Britain, and its empire. During this era, Britain was transformed from a predominantly rural, agricultural society into an urban, industrial one. Victorian literature differs from the literature of the 18th century and Romantic period most significantly, because it was not aimed at a specialist or elite audience. Rather, the Victorian period was a time when new genres appealed to the newly mass audiences. Periode Victoria terjadi pada akhir abad ke-19 dalam rentang waktu antara tahun 1837 sampai 1901, tahun-tahun di mana Ratu Victoria memerintah Inggris Raya dan imperiumnya. Selama era ini, Inggris berubah dari masyarakat yang dominasi tinggal di pedesaan, yaitu masyarakat pertanian, menjadi masyarakat perkotaan atau industri. Sastra Victoria berbeda dengan sastra abad ke-18 dan periode romantik, karena sastra ini tidak ditunjukkan untuk audiens spesialis atau elit, maksudnya adalah audiens dari kelas atas. Namun sebaliknya, periode Victoria adalah masa ketika genre baru menarik perhatian massa yang baru. Maksudnya dari massa yang baru adalah audiens atau massa yang berasal dari menengah ke bawah. Characteristics of Victorian prose. The first is Victorian Realism. The movement of Realism is generally a minor movement in the late 19th century, which began in France and was later followed by England. Realism was characterized by its attention to detail, as well as its attempt to recreate reality as it was. As a result, plot was no longer the central of the focus of the author, but rather creating interesting and complex characters to precedence. Realism also placed an emphasis on describing the material and physical details of life, as opposed to the natural world as characterized by the Romantic period. Jadi karakteristik prose pada periode Victorian yang pertama adalah Realisme Victoria. Gerakan realisme pada umumnya merupakan gerakan kecil di akhir abad ke-19 yang dimulai di Perancis, kemudian disusul oleh Inggris. Realisme dicirikan oleh perhatiannya terhadap detail, serta upayanya untuk menciptakan kembali realitas sebagaimana adanya. Alhasil, plot tidak lagi menjadi pusat perhatian pengarang, melainkan lebih diutamakan untuk menciptakan karakter yang menarik dan kompleks. Realisme juga menekankan pada penggambaran detail, materi dan fisik kehidupan, sebagai lawan dari dunia alami yang dicirikan oleh periode romantik. The second is Victorian Compromise. The Victorian period was a time of contradiction. On the one hand, there was the progress brought about by the Industrial Revolution, the rising wealth of the upper and middle classes, and the expanding power of Britain and its empire. While on the other hand, there was the poverty, disease, deprivation, and injustice faced by the working classes. Jadi karakteristik dari prose periode Victorian yang kedua adalah Victorian Compromise. Periode Victoria adalah masa kontradiksi, artinya di satu sisi ada kemajuan yang ditimbulkan oleh revolusi industri, meningkatnya kekayaan kelas atas dan menengah, serta kekuatan Inggris dan kekaisarannya yang berkembang. Namun di sisi lain, ada kemiskinan, penyakit, kekurangan, dan ketidakadilan yang dihadapi oleh kelas pekerja.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. So here I will explain about utilitarianism. So utilitarianism is a theory of morality which advocates actions that foster happiness and oppose actions that cause unhappiness or harm when directed toward making social, economic, or political decisions. Utilitarian philosophy will aim for the betterment of society as a whole. Utilitarianism will say that an action is right if it results in the happiness of the greatest number of people in a society or a group. Jadi di sini maksudnya ini adalah utilitarianisme ini adalah teori moral, merupakan teori moralitas yang menganjurkan tindakan yang menumbuhkan kebahagiaan atau kesenangan, namun menentang tindakan yang menyebabkan rasa yang tidak bahagia atau bahaya. Jadi utilitarianisme akan mengatakan bahwa suatu tindakan adalah benar jika menghasilkan kebahagiaan bagi sebagian besar orang dalam masyarakat atau kelompok. Jadi itulah pengertian dari teori utilitarianism. Yang kedua ini adalah understanding utilitarianism. So, utilitarianism is a tradition of ethical philosophy that is associated with Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, two late 18th and 19th century British philosophers, economists, and political thinkers. Utilitarianism holds an action is right if it tends to promote happiness, and wrong if it tends to produce sadness or the reverse of happiness. Not just the happiness of the actor, but that everyone affected by it. At work, you display utilitarianism when you take actions to ensure that the office is a positive environment for your co-workers to be in, and then make it so for yourself. Jadi di sini ya hampir sama dengan maksud yang sebelumnya. Utilitarianisme di sini adalah filsafat etika yang dikaitkan dengan Jeremy Bentham dan John Stuart Mill. Jadi mereka adalah filsuf, ekonom, dan pemikir politik Inggris akhir abad ke-18 dan ke-19. Ya, sama seperti yang tadi, utilitarianisme berpendapat bahwa suatu tindakan itu benar jika cenderung meningkatkan kebahagiaan dan salah jika cenderung menghasilkan kesedihan, dan kebalikannya. Jadi bukan hanya kebahagiaan aktornya, tetapi juga kebahagiaan semua orang yang terpengaruh olehnya. Misalnya tadi kan ada contoh di tempat kerja. Jadi Anda menunjukkan utilitarianisme Anda saat mengambil tindakan untuk memastikan bahwa kantor adalah lingkungan yang positif bagi rekan kerja Anda. Dan kemudian Anda melakukannya untuk diri sendiri. Jadi membuat diri sendiri Anda nyaman di tempat kerja. Jadi selanjutnya ya ini the three utilitarianism. Pertama ya ini pleasure or happiness is the only thing that has intrinsic value. Yang kedua, actions are right if they promote happiness, and wrong if they promote unhappiness. Yang ketiga, everyone's happiness count equally. Jadi maksudnya yakni dari yang pertama itu kesenangan atau kebahagiaan adalah satu-satunya hal yang memiliki nilai intrinsik. Yang kedua yakni tindakan itu benar jika mendorong kebahagiaan dan salah jika mendorong ketidakbahagiaan. Yang ketiga yakni kebahagiaan setiap orang sama pentingnya. Oke, sekian dari saya. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Now, let's talk about the Agnoticism. Agnoticism is defined as a belief that nothing is known or can be known of immaterial things, especially about the God's existence. This term was brought out by the T.H. Huxley in 1869, in which people who live in Victorian era were striving to explore and understand questions about metaphysical world. But the problem, they didn't find any answer and let it become their adopt in their thought. So the result, the realizations of God existence become stigma and make it into uncertain condition. Therefore, the functions of agnosticism was a means of identifying the skepticisms that stem from the inability to logically support the existence of spiritual beings. What about the comprehensive composition? It must be seen different from another work, like the Victorian novel, in which the compositions of Victorian prose is very long, unlike the Augustine's or Romantic essays. The prose writing of that period are treatises or theses, in which the size or the essays has unusual length. Which I mean the composition here is the placement or arrangement of visual element or material in a work of art. Next of all is about the unorganized composition. Like the Victorian novel, the compositions are not formally or even concisely organized. They are held together only by the argument contained therein, not by any formal or certain pattern. So for the example, like Ruskin's Unto This Last and Miles Liberty are, strictly speaking, not the work of literature. However, since they advocate the human view of life as against the political, economic, or biological, they are light into literature. Besides, they are written in a language and style which is not truly literary, approximates the style of literature.
Okay guys, the next material will be delivered by me. Poetry. Poetry was one of the most popular genres of the Victorian period. The Romantic poets, particularly William Wordsworth, who lived through the beginning of the period, dying in 1850, were revered and widely quoted. The Victorians experimented with narrative poetry, which tell a story to its audience, including Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Aurora Lake, 1856, an entire novel written in verse. Narrative poetry could also be much shorter, like Christian Rossetti's, with the title Goblin Market, 1862. Victorian poets also developed a new form called the dramatic monologue, in which a speaker recites the substance of the poem to an audience within the poem itself. For example, Robert Browning's with the title My Last Dashes, 1842. There is also lyric or non-narrative poetry, was written by Tennyson. including what is perhaps the most famous poem of the Victorian era, In Memoriam A.H.H. 1849. Tennyson wrote this book-length sequence of verse to commemorate the death of his close friends, Arthur Henry Hallam. The poem contains some of the most famous lines in literature, including "It's better to have loved and lost, or than never to have loved at all," and was widely quoted in the Victorian period. Okay, the Gothic. Although different kinds of realisms dominated the novel in the Victorian period, the 18th century tradition of the Gothic lived on, particularly in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre 1847. Jadi Gothic ini merupakan sebuah gambaran hasrat kehidupan yang dikemas dengan simbol kematian, melukiskan sifat sinis dengan cinta dan sentimen. Ini merupakan perpaduan dari hal-hal yang ekstrim seperti seks dan kematian, dan biasanya menggunakan kegelapan untuk meneranginya. Okay, the next is sensation fiction. Jane Eyre used some Gothic tropes, but sensation fiction, so named because its suspenseful plots inspired dangerous sensations in readers, more fully embraced the surprise and horror typical of the Gothic. Wilkie Collins' The Woman in White, 1859, which tells the story of two women who look strangely alike and are substituted for each other at various points, is perhaps the most famous example in this period. Nah, kalau sensation fiction sendiri, ini lebih ke menggambarkan sebuah kejutan dan hal horor. Nah, ini juga masih masuk ke dalam khas dari Gothic itu sendiri. Cuman fiksi sensasi ini biasanya berpusat pada penipuan dan bigami. Bigami itu apa sih? Bigami itu misalnya kayak bersuami dua atau beristri dua. Kan yang kita tahu kan cuman poligami kan, sama poliandri. Nah, kalau bigami ini mungkin yang mencakup kedua hal itu. Nah, di mana pria atau wanita dibujuk ke dalam pernikahan palsu atau bahkan lebih buruk lagi. Contoh lain adalah hal yang suatu karya di sensation fiction ini seperti karyanya dari Mary Elizabeth yang berjudul Brandon's Lady of the Secret pada tahun 1862. Nah, di mana di sini menceritakan seorang wanita yang dianggap gila dan dia membunuh suaminya sendiri. Tapi dia itu membunuh suaminya setelah dia menyadari bahwa dia itu telah menikah dengan lelaki lain. Nah, cerita ini sangat mengejutkan para pembaca di era Victoria. Jadi kayak cerita ini membuat orang-orang di Victoria period itu kayak shock about this story. Melodrama, the aims of sensation fictions was to surprise and trouble readers by challenging social conventions. But another Victorian genres, melodrama, achieved popularity by upholding popular values. Melodramas divide characters starkly into those who are fictitious and those who are virtuous. They evoke emotions in readers and viewers by making virtuous characters the subject of fictitious plots. These were some of the most popular theatrical productions of the period. Okay, next presentations will be delivered by my friend.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello guys, I'm Nur Hidayatul Fatihah and today I will explain to you about novel and different kind of realism. Okay, although poetry and plays were important in Victorian cultural life, the period is known as the Great Age of the Novel. The serial form of publishing engaged audience. Nah, jadi walaupun poetry dan juga plays ini memiliki peran yang sangat penting di Victorian period, tapi novel memiliki masa kejayaannya pada masa ini. Why? Because the first is the form of publishing is in serial form. Jadi pada masa itu novel-novel atau karya-karya itu dipublish dengan berseri seperti itu. And the second one, it's because improvement in paper making and also printing technology made printing books much cheaper. Jadi pada masa itu karena ada kemudahan teknologi sehingga paper making dan juga printing untuk publishing buku itu tadi lebih mudah, lebih murah seperti itu. And the third one is the rise of lending libraries which would individually lend out volumes of a book. Jadi banyak tersedia perpustakaan-perpustakaan yang akan menyediakan buku-buku atau karya-karya novel yang bervolume, berbanyak chapternya seperti itu. Jadi banyak yang tertarik untuk membaca novel in this era. Okay, the next is I will explain to you about the kind of realism. The kind of realism, first, we know that realism aims to portray the realistic event happening to realistic people in a realistic way, was the dominant narrative mode of the Victorian novel. Jadi because it's realism, so novelnya itu lebih ke realistic event that happen in realistic way seperti itu. Jadi yang realistic aja deh seperti itu. Novelnya genre-nya seperti itu. And the type, the variance is so many variants of realism. The first is satirical realism. For the example is from the work from William Makepeace, Thackeray's Vanity Fair. It has satirical realism inside that emphasize the words qualities of each character and suggest that the world or the Vanity Fair is dark and unfair place. Jadi satirical realism seperti kita udah pernah pelajari sebelumnya, satir berarti menyindir seperti itu. Okay, the second one is psychological realism. Psychological realism emphasize portraying the rich inner life of the character, their thoughts, their feeling, their motivation, their anxieties, and etc. The example is the work from George Eliot's Middlemarch. For instance, she portrays the progress of several marriages in a small provincial town. Jadi contoh psikologinya ini tentang pernikahan pada zaman itu. Seperti itu. Okay. The next is social realism. Social realism focuses on the foibles, eccentricities, and remarkable characteristics of people who are frequently caricatured, often comics and sometimes tragicomic. It is best exemplified by the work of Charles Dickens. Jadi social realism ini lebih ke remarkable characteristic of people. Jadi menekankan karakter-karakter dari seseorang di kehidupan sosial seperti itu. Okay, the next I will explain to you about journalism and periodical writing. Hello guys, okay, I will explain to you about journalism and periodical writing. With a cheaper price of printing, British journalism and periodical writing flourished and formed a significant part of Victorian literary production. Nah, pada masa ini karena semakin murah printing itu, akhirnya di jurnalis dan juga periodical writing ini mulai menulis non-fiction prose. Essayists like John Ruskin, Thomas Carlyle, Thomas Babington Macaulay, John Stuart Mill, and Matthew Arnold all wrote famous works of non-fiction prose that analyzed British history and critiqued current trends in British society. Jadi pada masa itu, journalism dan juga periodical writing menulis non-fiction prose yang lebih menganalisa ke hal-hal fakta seperti menganalisa British history and also mengkritik beberapa tren-tren yang sedang viral di British society seperti itu. Nah, besides that, the periodical prize raise awareness about important issue in British society. Jadi, journalism dan juga periodical writing ini lebih untuk meningkatkan kesadaran masyarakat akan isu-isu yang ada di British society seperti itu. Okay, for the next presenter, I will give it to the next presenter. Thank you.
Okay, now is children's literature. Children's literature in this era is the golden age for children, especially in 19th century. Like Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, 1865, and Through the Looking Glass, 1871, narrate the story of Alice, who finds herself in a place called Wonderland, populated by grinning cats, mad haters, and an evil queen, G.M. Barry Peter, and Wendy. 1911. Similarly imagines a fantastical place of mermaid lagoons, evil pirates, and fairy magic. And the last part is the fin de siècle. The last part of the Victorian period, roughly 1880 until 1900, is referred to as the fin de siècle, a French term that means end of the century. Novels from this period tend to be more melancholy and bleak than earlier Victorian works, which conventionally had happy endings. Fin de siècle literature is also characterized by a move away from the forms of realism that had dominated the earlier part of the century and into genre fiction. Thank you very much.
Oke, jadi selanjutnya yakni popular writer in Victorian Era. Jadi ini adalah beberapa contoh saja ya, namun tidak mencakup keseluruhan. Jadi yang pertama ya ini adalah Charles Dickens. Contoh karyanya yakni Pickwick Papers, Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby, Christmas Carol, David Copperfield, Bleak House, Little Dorrit, A Tale of Two Cities, Great Expectations. Yang kedua yakni George Eliot. Karyanya The Mill on the Floss, Silas Marner, Romola. Ketiga ini Thomas Hardy. Antaranya ini karyanya The Poor Man and the Lady Under the Greenwood Tree, Far from the Madding Crowd. Number 4 yakni William Makepeace Thackeray. Karyanya antara lain Vanity Fair, The Luck of Barry Lyndon. Yang kelima ini Elizabeth Gaskell. Contoh karyanya Lois the Witch, Cousins Phyllis, Mr. Harrison's Confession, The Poor Clare, A House to Let, Round the Sofa. Yang terakhir ini contohnya dari writer Wilkie Collins. Contoh karyanya antara lain The Woman in White sama The Moonstone. Okay, that's all from our presentation. Thank you for your attention. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.